Mouth and the meditations of all of our hearts be acceptable to you, O God, our strength and our salvation. Amen. Please be seated. Today, with the church throughout the world, we are observing the feast of the presentation of Christ in the temple. This feast has a funny sense of timing in that our Epiphany-tide lectionary readings have already taken us far beyond Jesus' childhood. The Feast of the Presentation, however, invites us back into a more chronological timeline, as it recalls Mary and Joseph bringing Jesus to the temple 40 days after his birth, as obliged by Jewish law to make a thank offering. When the young family arrives at the temple, they are quickly singled out by two elderly prophets who spend their days in the temple complex. The prophet Simeon makes a bold declaration that Jesus will be a light for revelation to the Gentiles and the glory of your people, Israel. A light for revelation to the Gentiles and the glory of your people, Israel. Simeon's declaration insinuates that Jesus will, first and foremost, serve as a light for revelation to the Gentiles. As such, it is clear that the origin of Jesus' often controversial mission to outsiders goes back not just to his first sermon in the synagogue at Nazareth, as we heard last week, but even further back, all the way back to his encounter with Simeon and Anna as an infant. Jesus' mission was not only to minister to outsiders, though, of course, but even more importantly, to be an agent of reconciliation, to work for the creation of a community where there would be no outcasts, which to those with a sense of Israel's universalizing mission would be easy to see as a fulfillment of God's commissioning of Israel to be a light to the nations. Whereas for others, Jesus' insistence on inclusion would be interpreted as something more like treason. And let's not forget that Jesus was still a baby. To be destined to be a light for revelation to the Gentiles is an enormous job to assign to a tiny baby and his shell-shocked parents. It must have been so overwhelming for Mary and Joseph to hear this prophecy about who their son was destined to be. Indeed, so much was already overwhelming about Jesus' origin and identity and purpose. And now Simeon was saying that Jesus would somehow manage to do the impossible, to bring together Jew and Gentile. Indeed, any first century Jew would have known that this was an almost laughably superhuman feat, and an endeavor that would surely make powerful enemies for anyone who undertook it. Indeed, to paraphrase Simeon, Jesus' controversial mission would give many people something to oppose, revealing who people really were. In other words, Jesus' mission would make him a lightning rod, a polarizing force in spite of unity being the paradoxical core of his message. Given the world in which we are living right now, it's easy to imagine why Jesus' mission of reconciliation would have aroused so much controversy. It's incredibly difficult to desire connection and unity when we're convinced that the other is not only wrong, but also bad, and perhaps even unclean. As in the ancient world, we too can easily imagine that engaging with the other will corrupt, pollute, and defile us, despoiling both our righteousness and our ideological purity. It's so easy to imagine that the badness of the other is contagious, and that the best thing we can do is hunker down with those who think and act and look just like us. However, whenever we let a fear of contamination keep us away from our neighbors who are different from us, the nativist ideologues are the real winners. For division begets even more division, until we are all at war with imagined enemies and no one feels safe. No one feels at home, which is exactly what the ideologues seem to want. And I, for one, have no interest in giving them what they want. So while it can feel as if, in the midst of dangerous times, the best way to stay safe is to isolate ourselves, isolation is perhaps the biggest danger of all. For if we withdraw from public spaces and public life, living on a diet of news reports and social media, our sense of the other as inherently dangerous will only continue to grow until we can no longer easily recall that they are human too. And this is not what our God, a God who risked persecution and death to bring Jew and Gentile together, desires for us. It can be so hard in the dark days we've been facing to stay open, to stay hopeful, to keep on trying to connect, to love, to reconcile. We need nourishment to keep following our bold and audacious God into the risky sorts of situations where reconciliation and redemption are most likely to happen. So we need to find ways to continually draw close to God in the midst of the very tumult that strives to pull us ever further away from our spiritual center. I take great comfort in words from today's psalm. How dear to me is your dwelling, O Lord of hosts. My soul has a desire and longing for the courts of the Lord. My heart and my flesh rejoice in the living God. The sparrow has found her a house, and the swallow a nest where she may lay her young. By the side of your altars, O Lord of hosts, my King and my God. Happy are they who dwell in your house. They will always be praising you. Happy are the people whose strength is in you, whose hearts are set on the pilgrim way. What I find so compelling in this psalm is that dwelling in God's house is not portrayed as being mutually exclusive with being set on the pilgrim's way. Indeed, to be a spiritual pilgrim, a person who is on a journey with God, always trying to follow God's lead into this world's most seemingly God-forsaken places, one must continually return to sources of spiritual refreshment and renewal. For our inner resources can so easily become depleted as we come face to face with suffering, sin, and evil. It is especially in these times of stress and strain, then, that we must heed our soul's longing to spend time with God. On Wednesday of this past week, I had a morning filled with hearing about the strain and struggle of others. By midday, I noticed myself getting overwhelmed, swamped by the arousal of my own anxiety as I tried to be a calm, centered, compassionate presence. On weekdays in the church office, I often find myself working through lunch or grabbing something quick without taking much of a break. But something inspired me this Wednesday to take myself out for a luxurious indulgence of a sit-down lunch at a restaurant with a cloth napkin, with hot food, and the pleasant hum of sociable conversation. And in the midst of that day's strain, this lunch break was a revelation. It wasn't just the nourishing food and the longer than usual pause in my day that I found restorative. It was also the warm, friendly interactions with strangers who served me. And it was the opportunity to witness a diverse coterie of people enjoying their lunches, which helped me to remember that life somehow does and will go on. We need to eat, we need to pause, we need to smile, we need to give thanks. Even as the world burns, we need to do these simple and yet profound things. For these are the things that keep us at home in our bodies, in our minds, and in our relationship with God, so that we can continue on the pilgrim's way. Today, in baptism, we welcome another beloved of God into the pilgrim way and into Christ's ministry of reconciliation. Just as Jesus was given an incredible calling in his infancy, so we declare an incredible calling for Henry this day. And so we also recall the calling and commissioning that each one of us experienced in our own baptisms. And though this calling may often feel beyond us, let us never forget the truth that our God chooses the foolish to shame the wise, and our God chooses the weak to shame the strong. That God chooses even the likes of us for God's good and holy purposes. May it be so.